going to be here in
You want
5
to watch me?
minutes.
Are you an adult? You want to watch?
Can you please stop?
Want to watch? Last
Please
chance.
stop your
Can you
power
move out of the way?
I'm coming down. My car's right now.
I used to believe that if you followed the rules, kept your head down, spoke politely, nothing bad would happen to you. That belief lasted right up until the night flashing red and blue lights painted my living room walls like a warning I never signed up for. It was late, not dangerous late, just quiet late, the kind where the street hums instead of talks. 2 cars were parked outside our place, one mine, one my brother-in-law's. Nothing fancy, nothing suspicious, just metal and tires resting where half the block parks every night. I remember joking that suburban streets look calm because nothing ever happens. Turns out they look calm because people don't notice what's happening to others. The knock came hard, impatient, like someone already decided how this conversation would end. When I opened the door, the officer didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was doing. He scanned me first, head to toe, just a half-second longer than necessary, long enough for instinct to whisper, "You're already behind." "Those your cars?" he asked. I said yes, calmly, automatically, the way you do when you assume reason still matters. He nodded once, sharp, and said, "They're getting towed." No warning, no request, no explanation. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about parking. This was about perception, and once perception hardens into suspicion, everything after that becomes inevitable. I stepped outside barefoot, phone still in my hand, trying to understand how a normal night turned into an emergency in someone else's eyes. The officer stood between me and my car like it was evidence instead of property. I asked the obvious question, the one any reasonable person would ask, "Can I just move it into the driveway?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the car, then at me again, then said something that still echoes in my head. "You don't own it." I told him who did. I explained. I stayed calm. I stayed respectful. And somehow every word I said made things worse. That's when the tow truck rolled in. Loud, mechanical, final. Chains clanking have a way of telling you your choices are gone. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, more like that familiar feeling of being misunderstood and knowing you won't be heard long enough to fix it. I stood closer to the car, not blocking anyone, not touching anything, just standing there because it was my space, my home, my right to be present. "Step back," the officer said. "Why?" I asked. "Because I said so." And that's where the misunderstanding became intentional. Now, let's pause here because this is usually where people argue. Some say the officer was just following procedure. Some say I should have backed up and stayed quiet. Some say this has nothing to do with race. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Policing isn't just about laws, it's about discretion, and discretion is where bias lives. Police are trained to assess threat levels in seconds: clothing, tone of voice, posture, neighborhood, vehicle type, and yes, race, whether consciously or not. Decades of data show that officers are taught to prioritize officer safety above all else, which sounds reasonable until you realize that safety assessments are often built on stereotypes passed down quietly, informally, through culture, not textbooks. When an officer sees someone who doesn't match their internal image of belonging, they interpret normal behavior as resistance. Asking questions becomes defiance. Standing your ground becomes obstruction. Emotion becomes aggression. That's exactly what happened next. I asked another question. What law am I breaking? He stepped closer. You're obstructing. By doing what? By not complying. That circular logic is deadly because once non-compliance replaces actual crimes, the interaction stops being about law and starts being about control. Backup arrived, not to de-escalate, but to reinforce authority. More uniforms, more radios, more eyes watching me like I'd already crossed a line no one could clearly explain. One officer said quietly, almost bored, "If you don't move, you'll be arrested." For what? No answer, just silence and expectation. I remember thinking about every time growing up when I was told to be twice as polite, twice as calm, twice as careful because people already assume things about you. I thought about how exhaustion feels when you are always the one expected to surrender first. So I stayed where I was, not aggressive, not loud, just present. And that's when hands grabbed my arms. Cold metal snapped shut, gravel pressed into my feet as the world tilted. I heard someone gasp. I heard a neighbor whisper, That's unnecessary. The officer said, "You're under arrest for resisting." Resisting what? Silence? Now, here's where the story changes, because power doesn't always win in the long run. I spent the night in a holding cell that felt colder than it needed to be. I replayed everything, wondering which version of myself would have been acceptable enough to avoid this outcome. Weeks later, the charges quietly vanished. No apology, no explanation, just a dismissal. That's the victory people don't talk about. Not the dramatic courtroom moment, but the quiet acknowledgement that what happened couldn't survive daylight. Because legally, the arrest relied on a fragile assumption that questioning authority equals obstruction. Courts don't like that when it's written down. Now, let's talk about why racial bias plays such a role here, clearly and honestly. Bias in policing isn't usually about hatred, it's about pattern recognition trained in the wrong direction. Officers are repeatedly exposed to crime statistics without context, shown footage of danger without balance, told stories that emphasize threat over humanity. Over time, their nervous system reacts before their reasoning catches up. When race intersects with location, vehicle, and confidence, officers subconsciously elevate the threat level. The response escalates faster, patience runs out sooner, authority hardens quicker. That doesn't make it acceptable, it makes it explainable. And explainable matters, because without understanding the mechanism, we can't fix it. The real danger isn't one bad arrest, it's normalization. It's teaching officers that dominance equals safety, and teaching citizens that silence equals survival. That night didn't break me, it clarified something. The system didn't fail, it worked exactly as designed, until it reached the courtroom, where design meets accountability. And that's where the power balance shifted. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. What if the officer wasn't evil? What if he genuinely believed he was doing his job? Does intention matter when impact ruins trust? Some viewers will say, just comply. Others will say, that could have been me. Both can be true at the same time, and that tension is exactly why this conversation matters. When law enforcement relies too heavily on compliance instead of clarity, it trains the public to fear interaction instead of respect it. When citizens assume every officer is biased, cooperation breaks down from both sides. The cost isn't theoretical, it's social, emotional, and sometimes fatal. So here's the real lesson that matters most. Rights don't protect you if you don't know them, but laws don't protect you if you ignore them either. You can be right and still end up in cuffs. You can be calm and still be seen as a threat. That's not justice, that's friction between power and humanity. So here's my question for you, and I want real answers in the comments. At what point does compliance stop being safety and start being surrender? And how do we demand accountability without turning every interaction into a battlefield? If you've experienced something similar, share it. If you disagree with me, explain why. Debate matters when it's honest. And remember this, live right, know the law, follow it, but never stop asking for transparency, because authority without explanation is not order, it's control. If you want more stories that break down power, bias, and responsibility without shouting or hiding, subscribe, engage, and keep the conversation alive. Because silence doesn't fix systems, people do.